Okay. Okay. Thank you, Professor Dasha. My name is Hiro Yamaguchi. It's a great honor to be participating in this class from Tokyo. And it's an honor to talk about TEPCO and new partnership with United Wind. So let me start with a quick introduction of TEPCO. Can you go to the next slide, please? Okay, so a quick introduction about TEPCO. Well, in Japan, there are 10 incumbent utilities, and TEPCO is the largest with 29 million customers in the Tokyo area. And it accounts for about a third of Japan's total electricity demand. So after the Fukushima nuclear accident and crisis of March 11, 2011, things have changed drastically for TEPCO because we became virtually bankrupt after the crisis, and we are nationalized by the Japanese government now. Although, as far as stable supply of electricity is concerned, we have the world's highest reliability of electricity, and we provide technical expertise to all over the world. For instance, we do various consulting projects, 600 projects for 70 countries in the last 10 years. So next slide, please. So let me touch on quickly about the progress.
Hold on just a second. We're getting a blank on, I'm seeing a blank on your slide, Brianna. There we go.
Thank
there
you.
we go.
Thank you. So let me just quickly touch on the progress in Fukushima, decommissioning and decontamination. So as you know, due to gigantic earthquake and tsunami, all the power was lost in Fukushima and 4 reactors suffered meltdown. But as you can see in the pictures, we have made a remarkable progress, and reactors are stably cooled, and preparations for spent fuel and debris removal are in progress at Fukushima. So the next slide, please. This is the organizational structure of TEPCO. We just shifted to a holding company structure in April of this year. So we have the holding company, and below that we have 3 major subsidiary companies. So holding company is basically responsible for Fukushima D&D, decontamination and decommissioning, and also Fukushima revitalization, and also compensation to the victims of the accident, and also restart of the remaining nuclear power stations. But also one of the important functions of the holding company is promotion of renewable energy, and also innovations and R&D related to that. And as a subsidiary, we have set up a fuel and thermal power generation company, and a transmission distribution company, and a retail company, as you can see. And for fuel and thermal power generation, if you click on,
there we go.
Yeah, we have formed an alliance with a Chubu Electric company that is in Nagoya, in Japan, and we will. As for the fuel procurement and thermal power, we will merge into this new company called JERA. So JERA will be a new company responsible for fuel procurement and domestic and international thermal power generation business. Okay, next slide. So let me just explain about the electricity system reform or deregulation in Japan. So in 2015, we have already set up organizations quite similar to independent system operators in the US. And in 2016, April, as I said, full deregulation of the retail market has been attained. Well, Japan's retail market deregulation began in year 2000, so it took 16 years to deregulate the whole market in Japan. And well, legal structural unbundling is required to all incumbent electric utilities by 2020. So we are sort of kind of catching up with the US in terms of deregulation. Next slide, please.
Before we go to that, Yamaguchi-san, can I ask? When you say that the full deregulation of the retail market, does that mean that there will be other private providers of retail electricity in Japan?
Yes, that is correct.
Okay.
Yeah. So retail competition is opened. So residential customers, can choose any supplier other than TEPCO, and there are more than 100 new suppliers, energy, well, we call it PPSs, but they're new suppliers who are in the market. So
Okay.
we already have a lot of competition, and TEPCO has already lost about 1 million customers. So that's a big churn.
Okay. Thank you very much for the clarification.
Okay, so this slide explains that power demand and sales is declining due to population decline in Japan and also energy conservation in Japan, and of course competition. So we have a shrinking market in Japan. So that is why TEPCO is looking at the international market for growth, especially the Asian market, where there is still we expect a lot of growth in Asian countries. So next slide. This is a slide that shows the energy mix um, before March 11, 2011, and what happened after. So before March 11, 2011, we had a sort of a balanced energy mix. As you can see, nuclear playing a big role as a base load of power. But after the crisis of 2011, we lost all of the nuclear um, power stations after that. So as you can see, in year 2014, we had to significantly increase our reliance on fossil fuels, namely coal and LNG. And TEPCO were importing or buying most expensive LNGs in the world. Uh, so as you can see on slide 2030, um, there is a plan, a government plan to sort of restart some of the nuclear power stations remaining. We have a remaining nuclear power station called KK, Kashiwazaki Kariwa in Niigata Prefecture, but we do not know when it will get restarted. So as you can see, we have to increase the proportion of nuclear, renewable, which is the
The
blue
top.
part on the top.
While we're on this slide, let me ask, all of the oil and all of the LNG is imported from abroad, right?
Yes, almost all of the fossil fuels are imported,
Including the coal.
including coal. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, we will start importing from the U.S. as well, but we basically import mainly from Middle East countries and also Asian countries and Australia.
Okay. Thank you.
So as for renewables, the Japanese energy policy shifted to promote renewables after the crisis of 2011. So just like maybe not the U.S., but just like European countries, we introduced a feed-in tariff system in July 2012. And so the installed capacity of renewables has been increasing in a rapid pace. Um, we don't have the numbers in the graph, but for instance, the installed capacity of renewable energy was like 1.5 gigawatt in 2011, but now it's close to 10 gigawatts.
Wow.
And we're looking at like more than 20 gigawatts by 2030. So Japan, as an energy policy, we are going to increase renewables for energy security reasons. So the next slide. Okay, so this slide shows four big trends that are going on in the energy industry in the world, which starts with a D, which is namely deregulation, decentralization, decarbonization, and digitalization. So deregulation, I've talked about full market competition in Japan. US and England is ahead in deregulation and Europe. And in Asian countries, we see that some Asian countries has started deregulation. So this is a worldwide trend. And the second, decentralization. This is basically distributed energy resources is increasing. What I mean that photovoltaics, batteries, and other sources of energy is distributed. So we're changing from a centralized power system to a distributed power system. And the third one is decarbonization. As I said, the renewables is increasing, even in Japan, but it's increasing at a more rapid pace in US, England, and China, and other places. Uh, solar, wind, and biomass, and other stuff. And the last one is digitalization. So IT technology is changing the energy industry. For instance, there are a lot of intelligent software that controls those distributed energy resources, which enables a totally different world from shift from centralized power to decentralized power. So drastic transformation and change is going on in the energy industry around the world, and also disruption is going on. So that is why we need to proactively act and overcome these challenges. Next slide, please. Can you keep on pushing?
Keep pushing?
Yeah, so thank you.
Okay, this is good.
Yeah, so we have started to invest in innovative companies in the US and looking for companies in Europe as well. So the investment thesis is there, namely renewables, microgrids, storage technologies, and disruptive technologies like blockchain and artificial intelligence and data analytics. So we believe that these will change the way we do business.
So would you call this corporate venture capital, or is this more investment through joint ventures and business partnerships?
It's both.
Okay.
Yeah, it's both.
Okay.
So yeah, so TEPCO. So my team is promoting these investments and innovation, and trying to disrupt ourselves before we get disrupted by someone else.
Okay.
So I'll stop here.
Okay. So thanks very much. You do have a slide on the partnership, or shall we go to Dan for this?
Yeah, I'll mention afterwards.
Okay, so we'll come back to your presentation after we see Dan's presentation. Brianna, keep that kind of handy, okay? Dan, the floor is yours.
Can you hear me in Japan? I have a mic on.
We can hear you and we can see you.
All right. Well, thank you, everyone, and thank you, Professor Dasher, for having me. I'm very excited to be here today and introduce United Wind and the exciting partnership that we've formed here with TEPCO. You know, our vision and our goal at United Wind has been consistent over time as the company's evolved, and it's really to provide affordable clean energy to millions of property owners globally. And we're starting to see that more and more through partnerships we're forming, much like the one we'll talk about today with TEPCO. A little bit about United Wind, and I'll even go before the history that this slide touches on, but United Wind started as a software technology company. It was a company called Wind Analytics, and it developed a software tool that allowed, based on a specific latitude and longitude, to predict with fairly high degree of accuracy what the wind resource would be on a specific residential location. And the reason for that was there were a lot of, historically in the US market, rural customers who had on-site wind generation is not a new technology, but what was new was that those customers weren't necessarily getting the best quality, they weren't knowing how much power was going to be produced, and so this software tool allowed customers who wanted to pursue that technology to have some way to quantify what the benefits would be. What we realized is that moving from there forward, it was a software tool that didn't have a lot of pull with it. And in order to kind of help pull and bundle that software tool, we decided to pair it with a combination with an installer. And so a best-in-class installer and Wind Analytics, a company called TEPCO and Wind Analytics merged and formed United Wind in about 2013. So then under the United Wind umbrella, we had this software tool and the capability to install, and then further to increase the velocity and throughput, we added on to that a financing component, and that's what's created United Wind as it stands today. And really the objective is to be a full suite development and asset management company that focuses on a specific asset, distributed wind energy. Machines that we operate today are on the smaller scale, 10 to 100 kW, but we have plans to go up to as much as 900 kW. And we are responsible for all the asset management over the full life of the wind lease, which is 20 years, and I'll get into that. But the value proposition is not just the financing where we cover all the upfront costs. It's that we provide them to a customer by having a savings over time. And in addition to that, we guarantee the performance of the asset over the term of the lease. And that value proposition resonated with a lot of strategic investors here, TEPCO being one of them. And a lot of that was driven by our ability. We have now 4 funds where we deploy capital into these projects. So United Wind has raised corporate capital and has raised project level capital as well. And so these are the investors within those different segments. This is the value proposition that I started to talk about, where basically when we approach a customer, we identify them based on, in the United States, using the software tool, what will be a good wind resource area. We then further drill down into what are the rate tariffs in those areas, which customers have enough land for us to pursue the development of one of these turbines on. And then we approach them with what effectively is a wind quote. And that wind quote shows them how much they're paying now, and under a wind lease, what their value proposition would be between the wind lease payment and the remaining electricity bill. And that leads to the remaining savings. And so over the life, we see that there's really savings of around 25%, if not more. And our systems, depending on, in the US, the net metering rules and regulations, will power anywhere between 50, 70, up to and over 100% of the load at the customer's property.
Dan, before you go on, let me ask a quick question.
Sure.
Basically, in these projects, United Wind actually provides the turbine, and the customer just leases the service of having it on the property and the power and so forth. The capital cost for putting in the turbine is something that you bear?
That's correct. So United Wind covers 100% of the upfront cost, effectively financing the system for the customer. And that's one of the pillars of value that we offer. So there's the technical value proposition of the actual technical piece of equipment, and then there's the financial value proposition that we offer. And the next slide here shows a little bit about all the different divisions within United Wind. You know, unlike some of the behind-the-meter distributed solar generation companies, which is what we assimilate to most when we compare ourselves comp-wise to other companies, we have all in-house capabilities of doing the construction, installation, and the O&M. A lot of times that's outsourced. Given the nascency of the industry in the United States, what we've found is we have actually acquired the company that we outsourced to before and found that we're able to do the installations on a much, much cheaper scale. So it's actually helpful for us from a margin standpoint. So everything from the sales to the wind analysis, providing the financing, and then doing the installation and long-term maintenance. But those are all components, and the customer, to your point, Professor Dasher, really just signs the wind lease, which obligates them to make monthly payments that are consistent for the next 20 years. But in return for that, we take care of everything for them.
Okay.
This is, I don't know how well it comes out, I guess on the big screen here, gives you a representative sample of our portfolio, which currently is in New York. We have portfolio that sort of is in different points of development, fully placed in service, what we call when it's under operation, assets in construction, assets in development. At the time of this slide, it always sort of, I try and have it updated before I speak each time, but we had nothing that was credit pending, which was nice. And we usually try and maintain a very healthy pipeline. In this case, in New York, this fund is our 3rd fund, and we will likely close out the 3rd fund in 2017. And we've already raised our 4th fund, which will be around $200 million that we'll deploy, and I'll talk about that in the Midwest. And then obviously looking very much at international markets through TEPCO and seeing what we can do there. This gives an example of the type of technology. These range in size from small 10 kilowatt systems to as large as 900 kilowatts, so almost a megawatt. The type of customer profile that we would use behind each of these would be very different. The 10 kilowatt would be much similar to a residential type of customer, whereas 900 you're getting to a fairly large commercial industrial customer. But all of these are certified, approved customers. The technology is what I'm referring to, and we go through a pretty rigorous technology review process internally that allows us to make the technology financeable and bankable. And that's important for us in our funds. So we review and go through a fairly extensive vetting process with independent engineers and visiting sites and existing turbines and so forth to get a feel for how they're operating. The wind analytics software, as I mentioned, is something that we continue to use today. This is sort of the core of where United Wind started. Again, it's built on analysis of algorithms and software that we take based on triangulating existing weather data stations, cleaning up the data, and then accounting for obstructions and so forth between where those towers are and where the site is that we're going to place a turbine on. That allows us to use this sort of siting location and come up with fairly predictive analysis as to how the wind will blow over time, and can therefore guarantee to the customer what we feel the performance will be of the asset over the 20-year lease.
Okay.
This is a fairly boring page, but this is our typical lease. A lot of customers are always very focused on this in the beginning. It's a 20-year lease. At the end of the lease, they have several options. They can either choose to renew the lease, which is the most likely scenario since it's built, it's there, and they're happy with it. They have the option as well to purchase the turbine on their own and take over control. They can request it to be removed. There's a cost-sharing mechanism associated with that. The fourth option is that they may choose to abandon it and allow us to sell the power at that point on a wholesale basis to the local utility as a qualified facility in the United States. Their obligation.
So, again, very simplistic question. They're paying you a flat rental fee, and their income would be variable depending on how much wind actually comes in through the turbine, because they are able to get, I guess, most of the revenue from selling the wind to the power company? Your customers are?
So in the United States, where we operate, there is a concept called net metering. And so the customer, when the wind is blowing and the customer is using electricity, they are using the electricity first from the wind turbine. To the extent that they're not using electricity or their load is not requiring all of it, then there's this net metering concept where the electrons flow back to the grid and the customer gets full retail credit for those electrons. So they're effectively reducing their bill as they're effectively not home.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah. Otherwise, the obligations are primarily lie with us as the lessor of the equipment. We're obligated to insure the system, repair it, maintain it for the full 20 years, and take over and provide effectively a long-term production guarantee so that they're sure as to how much they will earn over that period of time.
Okay.
These are our funds that I was alluding to. We had started early on with very small funds for proof of concept behind what it is we're doing. That then led to larger funds with more institutional investors, and that then brought in more and more institutional corporate capital to fund the platform. These are two different types of financing structures that we use in the United States. One is a very simple single investor lease where we would develop the assets, we would sell them to an investor who would take both the tax benefits and cash benefits that the projects would produce. In the other case here under a partnership flip, It's a more complicated tax structure. This is unique to the U.S. market, where the U.S. market incentivizes renewable energy with a combination of tax credits and cash. Abroad, as I understand in Japan and in many countries in Europe, there's a more simplified feed-in tariff structure, which actually makes the financing a little bit easier. In the United States, you have to have a specific type of income to shelter for tax benefits, depending on the type of project that's going up. And for that, we have partnerships with big institutional tax players like U.S. Bank that I showed on the previous page that allow us to monetize those benefits. When we monetize those benefits, those customers invest in the project. When they invest in the project, we can reduce the cost of the lease payment that the customer pays. So a simple way to think about it is we harvest these benefits and we pass on the savings to the customer.
Okay.
And this is the pipeline that we're looking at right now in the United States. So as you can see, we're moving away from New York. We're moving more into the Midwest. And that's really just driven by the fact that that's where the best wind resource is in the United States. And we see that we're really not competing with these behind-the-meter solar companies because they tend to play on the coasts where there is a very good good solar resource. When it comes to competing head-on, it really depends on how good the solar irradiance is versus the wind. In the Midwest, we find that the cost of electricity we can provide many times can actually beat that of solar because of the fact that the wind is so strong. And this is where we see broadly market opportunities. In the U.S., it's multiple billions of dollars of opportunity, and we're sort of just scratching the surface in the beginning here. And that is a couple members of our team. And that's really what I have. I can reserve comment as far as with TEPCO, the partnership, but it's whenever you would like, I can get into that too.
Okay, we'll talk about that in just a minute. Brianna, I'm going to ask you if you will switch presentations back to Yamaguchi-san's presentation again, because I want to first ask about this partnership really kind of from the way it looks to TEPCO. Why is TEPCO getting involved in this? Yamaguchi-san, the floor is yours again.
Oh, okay. So as I explained, in Japan, we have a tremendous challenges in the energy mix. We don't know when the nuclear will ever start. It might not start. And also, as I said, we are buying the most expensive LNGs from the Middle East. Energy security standpoint, we need to make use of every kind of renewable resources in Japan. TEPCO already has a couple of utility-scale wind turbine generation in Japan, almost 1 gigawatt. So we have been sort of utilizing big wind turbines already. And also, as for solar, there are a lot of photovoltaics, not TEPCO-owned, but a lot of housing has solar.
Actually, I have to say this has been something that I've really noticed the last few times I've flown into Narita Airport. You see lots of these small, field-sized solar arrays that, they're springing up like mushrooms. Instead of rice, you now have solar arrays.
That's right. So photovoltaics are rapidly increasing. The reason for that is, as Dan mentioned, because of the feed-in tariff prices in Japan. This is the government set a pretty high feed-in tariff price in 2012 to promote renewables. So solar is increasing, and large-scale wind utility is increasing. But we did not have a small-scale wind turbines in Japan. That is probably because it's difficult to predict how much wind there is. And as long as there's some, software like wind analytics that the United Wind has, we did not have any sort of scientific scientific evidence.
And maybe you've got a slide on this. Brianna, move one slide, next slide, okay? There we go. This is it.
This is it. Yeah.
And what I was going to ask is one reason I think for the extremely large turbines that you see in Japan is that power production was relatively centralized.
Right.
And they're really, the technology to handle this distributed production is quite new, I think. And so it was not employed in Japan very much, correct?
That is correct, yeah. We did not have the technology to deploy small-scale wind turbines in Japan. Well, no one had.
Yeah.
We didn't have the analytics thing. We did not have this finance model.
Right.
So no one was able to provide benefit to customers. Even though for small wind, Japanese government has set a pretty high feed-in tariff price, which is 55 yen per kilowatt, which is pretty high. But even though we did not see a lot of small-scale wind in Japan, so in Japan, in the northern part of Japan, we have relatively wind resources. Or in the southern part of Japan. So there are still resources, maybe not as much as the U.S. or Europe, but so we need to utilize those resources as much as possible using United Wind's technology and business model. So that's why TEPCO is very happy and to partner with United Wind to explore opportunities in the Japanese market. And,
Okay, so it's really about the Japanese market more than it is about globalizing TEPCO's business model to obtain additional revenue from the U.S. market.
Well, actually, we are thinking about it. So we will start looking at the Japanese market first. But if it goes well, of course, we'd like to seek opportunities in other Asian countries. I think there's a big market in the Asian countries, so and of course in Europe as well. So I think there's a lot of potential market for the small wind generation business.
Okay, I was under the impression that Japan was kind of a difficult place for wind. That being a very mountainous kind of narrow set of islands, that unlike the North Sea and the rolling plains of Germany, it would be really hard to have very large arrays of wind turbines. Is my impression correct?
I think that's correct. It's not easy, in Japan to sort of do wind business, but for small wind, I believe that there are places that we could sort of utilize small winds because for small winds, I understand that we don't need as much wind as the big turbines.
Okay.
And also, because Japan is a very mountainous country, we were unable to sort of build big wind turbines in the mountains, but we can sort of take the small winds anywhere in Japan where there's wind. So we are going to sort of do some market research.
And United Wind's, optimization of location is also, that turns it from expensive trial and error into something that can be much more strategically implemented.
Yep.
You've got one more slide, which is a thank you slide. So let me suggest that we move into the Q&A part of this. So how did you find United Wind? Yamaguchi-san, how did you find out about these people?
We were sort of looking for innovative companies in the U.S. and Europe. And we have this person is absent today, but we have a gentleman called Mr. Jeffrey Cha, who is having experience in investing in venture companies, and he's helping us find.
That's right, and Jeffrey was my introduction to you, which I really appreciate.
Yeah, he's really good at hunting these innovative companies.
Yeah, let me give a little bit of background. Jeffrey is an serial angel entrepreneur, angel investor, and entrepreneur who's lived in Japan for probably 20 years. He's started at least 6 companies and taken 3 or 4 of them public. So Jeffrey is a good person to know in this space. Okay, so he kind of helped you look around for this. Dan, let me ask you kind of from the other side, what was your first impression when you heard from Tokyo Electric Power Company? Is this like way far away and not in the markets we're developing? What kind of reaction did United Wind have?
No, I think it's a great question. So when I came on board, I was overseeing a lot of critical initial initiatives, and one of them was to try and maintain focus on what we are doing, because I think as you may know well, that one of the biggest killers for startups is trying to do too many things too quickly and losing focus. So, you know, but it has, as I said, always been part of our vision to bring our value proposition to customers globally. So I think when TEPCO had reached out, it actually came to my email address first, oddly enough. And I think in my career, I have actually started companies in feed-in tariff markets, so I'm very familiar with the feed-in tariff structures in foreign markets. And really, I think the interest from United Wind standpoint that resonated to me right away and to other members of my team is twofold. One, first of all, it really furthered our mission that we wanted to take our value proposition globally, but there were 2 kind of critical components to that. One is we needed to find the right market to grow in internationally first, and we needed to find the right partner to be able to do that with. We knew that it wasn't something that our team alone was going to be able to accomplish. So when you have the largest utility in, the 3rd largest economy in the world calling you with interest, obviously it's a phone call you want to take and take very seriously. The market feed-in tariff is one that it is very lucrative for precisely the type of turbines and the size of systems that we are active in. So that was one that I think from our standpoint was a big driver of interest. The other key for us goes back to this strategic partnership, and from our standpoint to grow as a company, being sort of a little fish in the big sea of utilities, you need to have not just strategic relationships, but you need to also understand how the utilities think. And it's a very different thought process than an entrepreneurial startup, but I think there's things that can be learned both ways. And from our standpoint, that's another key driver for us in building a relationship with TEPCO, is making sure we internally can join forces and learn how TEPCO and frankly other international utilities do look at their markets and foreign markets to help see where we can kind of fit in better.
Okay, there's one other thing that I want to ask, and then I'll turn over the questions to the floor, and that is typically the time required to make decisions in large Japanese companies is a lot longer than startup companies in the United States are willing to wait for. And I'm really curious how things proceeded after your first email and first phone call. Yamaguchi-san, what was the biggest challenge in getting TEPCO to agree to this partnership?
Well, as you can imagine, TEPCO is one of the most traditional, conservative, big, large companies, which is very slow in decision making. And as you can imagine, one of the big challenges was to make an investment decision. This was TEPCO's first investment in a international venture companies. Well, in the past, we've done investments in international thermal power projects, and that took time. That was okay because there were a lot of things to think about, risks and stuff like that. But for venture investments, we knew that we had to act quickly. So we tried our best to sort of to make the decision quickly, even though I think we need a lot of improvement.
I kind of suspect I'm looking at the champion of the project, where you probably took a lot of personal risk in the company to make this happen. Dan, what about the U.S. side? How did you manage to get the rest of the management in United Wind to learn how to talk to this big utility that was interested in investing?
Well, I think it was probably a much smoother process on our side than in TEPCO, and I'm guessing there. But really, from our standpoint, the management team is rather small. We took it to the board fairly quickly when there was an expression of interest, and we kind of smoked it out a little bit and found how sincere it was. Had a couple conversations. TEPCO visited our office a few times, and along that path, it really, in my opinion, it actually, to me, didn't feel like it was very slow and bureaucratic. I mean, I was rather impressed with the speed that we saw. It was, I would say, a few-month process, which in the VC space isn't unheard of for investors to identify diligence and make an investment. So we were happy with that, and like I said, I think there's a lot more ahead for us to explore. But really, I think being in TEPCO's backyard, there's probably more work for us to do to get smart and learn. But we're very much prepared for that challenge.
Okay, great. Why don't we open the floor to questions? And I've got a couple lined up if nobody has a question. So Dan, kind of you give me the heads up if you want me to ask one.
Any question? Sure. We'll start here, I guess.
So this question, you mentioned in that one of your ways that you evaluate a potential leasing is if there's enough property. In Japan, there's a lot, the property holdings tend to be much smaller than in the United States. So realistically, how much of a market do you see over there?
Yeah, so it's a great question, and we are working. So maybe Professor Dasher and Yamaguchi-san, did you guys hear that, or should I repeat the question?
Why don't you repeat the question, okay?
So the question was market size in Japan, if I understand correctly, and what is the market opportunity given that the lot size of customers might be smaller than those in rural environments in the Midwest of the United States. And this goes to really where we are right now with TEPCO. In the United States, it also depends on which state you go into, really which zoning territory, and what are the setback rules within certain municipalities. So we have to already adjust to that when we enter a market. And just as we're doing so now with TEPCO, we are performing diligence on, we know there are actually technology suppliers of ours in the United States who are already in Japan. So from that standpoint, vetting the technology is a fairly simple process. Getting to know the wind, that's sort of the core of one of the things we can do. But it's a great question on customer plot size, and that's really, I think, something that we're forming this partnership with TEPCO and going to be relying on them as well for being able to diligence certain items like that. But to the extent that they're not as focused from a constraining standpoint of lot size, that would help, but we'll have to look at it. Okay,
thanks, Dan. Yamaguchi-san, would you comment on that, the market opportunity in Japan?
Yeah. So it is true that Japan is a small country compared to the United States. And there's a small land, and Japan is a mountainous country. But there are a couple of, quite a few, farmers and dairies in the rural areas of Japan. And, as I said, northern part of Japan, like Hokkaido and Tohoku, there's quite a lot of wind resources, and there are dairies and farmers out there. And maybe in Japan there could be other sort of potential customers. I don't know, maybe other factories or municipalities or even parks. You never know. So that is what we are trying to sort of do market research together with United Wind, and we'll see what happens.
Okay, thanks. Next question, please.
Yes.
How come your company didn't work on California? California has a lot of wind turbines.
California does have a lot of wind turbines. We find that the wind resource in California for residential customers is not as strong as it is in the Midwest, is one point. It's a market that we're considering in the longer term. We just see more near-term opportunity in the Midwest. And the other thing, California, like New York, is, from what I understand, a more difficult permitting state. And I can say this being in New York, it is really difficult to permit in New York, yet we're doing it. And part of that is because there's a very generous grant incentive that the state is providing. But in a free market sense, where we're trying to go in the United States is where the wind resource is strongest for us, and that's really the Midwest for the time being.
Let me follow through with Yamaguchi-san and ask how far the permitting process in Japan has developed for this kind of small production. I'm guessing that a lot of the regulations may not be clear yet.
Yeah, I think you're right. We are sort of doing research as to what kind of permitting process is necessary for small-scale winds. There are several processes for utility scale, and we know about it. But I think Japanese policymakers have not made a regulation or for small scale because we didn't have a market before. So I think we need to do some lobbying and talk to the regulators and local governments. So that's our job to do.
And this is one reason United Wind needs a very large partner for this kind of expansion.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. Next question.
Yes.
This is for Mr. Yamaguchi. What other new energy technologies are you keeping an eye on that have the potential to be a game changer? Something like a new method of coal liquefaction or a new method of carbon monoxide capture, or just what?
So besides wind and besides PV, what are the kind of really areas that TEPCO thinks are kind of hot to watch?
Well, actually, what we are sort of watching is not the renewable technology itself, but rather IT technologies that sort of utilize those distributed renewable resources. Maybe I've mentioned before, but there are a lot of IT companies in the US and in Europe that that has the intelligent software to sort of control PVs and batteries.
Can I follow through with that? Because one of the technical aspects of this kind of renewable energy source is connecting it to the grid.
Right.
And I'm guessing that United Wind has to work that out with the utility in order to deliver a project. But separate from that, there are all kinds of technologies that are necessary. Substation level battery backups and this kind of thing. How does TEPCO feel about, for instance, electric vehicles as a potential alternative storage mechanism for power?
Interesting question. Well, we have started talking with the auto manufacturers in Japan, like Toyota or Nissan or Honda, who are manufacturing are willing to manufacture electric vehicles. Because we see that electric vehicles can become a resource as a battery. When they are not driving, when they're parked at homes, they are basically batteries are unutilized. So it could be used as a resource to sort of to connect and aggregate, and there could be a sort of a sharing of electricity among consumers, or we could sort of aggregate and sell it to the grid. And there's all sorts of ways that we could utilize those resources. So we are in discussion with the automakers at the moment.
Okay. Does that answer your question?
Yes and no.
Well, I think there's let me chime in because there's an awful lot of really early stage technologies that are so far away from commercialization. The big question is how much money a utility can afford to pay to watch. Everything from, tidal movements and wave movements as a continuing source of energy to, hydrogen. And there are some big research projects in Japan about hydrogen, not just the kind of fuel cells that are in automobiles, but in much larger capacities, and storage of hydrogen and so forth. So it's kind of a mess because there is a lot of alternatives kind of on the horizon. But how do you, and Yamaguchi-san, how do you sort of prioritize projects that you would really look at to invest in? What kind of makes a really good investment project for you as opposed to, that's nice, I'll wait until I hear more on the news?
Well, I think there are a lot of new technologies, as Professor mentioned. Well, of course, TEPCO's R&D division is sort of watching and doing the research and doing development by themselves. But from my perspective, my capacity, my job is to sort of look for technology and business models that will disrupt the energy industry in the future.
So it has to be big. It has to be disruptive.
That's right.
Actually, I hear that from companies that do open innovation a lot. This is one of the characteristics. You don't want just something, a little thing. It's not worth the risk. But right. Okay. Thanks. Yeah, thanks for your question. I'm not sure we can answer it any better than that. Next question, please.
Yes.
Hi, my question is around timeline. The question to Dan is how long does it typically take for you to install wind turbine from, say, initial inquiry from customer to actually starting the power generation? And the question to Yamaguchi-san is it going to be similar in Japanese market? And more importantly, when can we expect to see the first wind turbine installed by United Wind in Japanese market?
Okay, Dan, I'll let you cover that, but please restate the question for us. It was kind of hard to hear that part.
Sure. So the question is, I guess it was in both markets. In the U.S. market, how long does it take United Wind to go from initial customer inquiry to a fully operating turbine? And what does TEPCO think it will be in Japan as far as a timeline, and when will the first United Wind TEPCO partnership turbine be operating in Japan? So I can take the first piece and then pass it along. The answer in the United States is it depends on who the customer is and what size turbine they are looking for. Well, usually the customer doesn't know what the size of the turbine is they're looking for. It's something that United Wind helps them determine based on when we look at their utility bill. One of the things that United Wind, as a new company that's really focused on growth and efficiency, has done well recently is cut down the time to go from our initial customer inquiry to quoting that wind lease. And that used to take a lot longer amount of time. We've managed to compress that. And then we've managed to compress the component that goes from customers' initial first quoting the wind lease to getting them to sign it. And part of that's driven by we went out and actually hired from NRG, one of the larger unregulated utility arms here in the United States, the sales team, starting with the guy who ran all of sales for the United States, and they were focused on doing the residential model where they would go sit at the kitchen table and would do the 1-6 close. In wind, it's a little bit harder to do that, so the actual sales component can take a couple weeks, but that's down from, I would say, a couple months, so that's shortened. And then as far as getting equipment to site, that usually can take about, well, the full development timeline can take a couple months. The actual construction timeline may be a week to 3 weeks. So you can talk about within a 3-month period to 4-month period, a customer can have, from the first time we talk to them to a system operating. It depends on the local permitting laws and so forth, which in Japan we're still diligencing. But Yamaguchi-san, I guess I'll let you comment if you have any thoughts in Japan. And
while Yamaguchi-san is getting ready to comment, can I ask you, Dan, do you have to do an environmental impact report every time you talk to a new customer? Or is there a way to shorten that process? Because I know there's concern about, birds being caught by the turbines and that kind of thing.
Yeah, so the size of the system, I think, is what drives whether an environmental impact assessment is required. For the portfolio that I put on the screen for New York, that is not required. Those are fairly small. They're 10 kilowatt size systems. They're below the FAA requirements in the United States. So from that standpoint, it's a pretty simple process. I think and in Japan, this lucrative feed-in tariff, it goes up to systems that are 20 kilowatts in size, and then the tariff drops a little bit for systems that are larger than that. But the bottom line is, in the U.S., if we go up in size, we may end up facing that. I can't speak for Japan, I guess, as to whether there'd be an impact assessment required.
Okay. Yamaguchi-san?
Yes, so United Wind and TEPCO has just started market research in Japan. And we're sort of aiming for the first project in Japan, sometime next year. But, we expect a lot of challenges, like there could be local permit issues or regulatory issues. There are some other processes. So there are challenges to overcome, but we are aiming for next year, and TEPCO will try to move quickly as possible.
Okay. At least one thing about partnering together is the connection to the grid should be a problem you can solve together, as opposed to just having a customer relationship or some sort of a permission relationship from the grid operator. I can imagine that's a challenge for United Wind.
Yeah, certainly in the U.S. market, without any utility partnership, we are required to work with the utilities in those locations. In the U.S., if it's a co-op utility versus an IOU, co-ops are not regulated by the government in terms of being obligated to purchase renewable energy, whereas IOUs are. And so the interconnection process, for example, in New York, is actually fairly simple because we're selling to IOUs or 3 IOUs, and those guys are obligated to take renewable energy. Whereas when you're dealing with a co-op in the Midwest, we feel that the interconnection challenges might be a little bit more challenging. However, the building permits side is going to be a lot easier because putting up a 140-foot tower in the middle of Kansas doesn't raise as many eyebrows as it does in New York. So, it kind of there's a...
Okay. I have a couple of quick questions. First one to Yamaguchi-san. You mentioned that in 2030, probably renewables will make up around 20 to 25% of the energy in Japan. And I'm curious, is that a physical limit, or do you think it could achieve even a larger percentage of the energy produced in Japan, or are we waiting for a new technology that would disrupt this, or a little more on the 2030, how you see that?
Okay, well, this is a government target, this 20%, but in other countries like UK or Germany, they have more ambitious goals, like 80% or 50% total energy mix. So I think Japan could attain that goal, but I think the constraint would be, as you mentioned, the grid constraint. because we have a sort of a weak grid, we have a sort of a weak interconnection in Japan. I think we need to sort of upgrade the transmission system as well as the distribution system in order to sort of have more renewables.
Okay, okay. And a quick question for Dan. Uh, would you mind commenting on the troubles that Solar City has had with a similar leasing model in the kind of PV side of things? They're really not doing very well. What's been their problem?
Wow. Well, they. I guess it depends how you look at it. I mean, So I've come from the solar space as well. So I've done a lot in solar and a lot in wind, utility scale and distributed. United Wind is my first distributed wind platform. But the similarities between solar and wind are the two biggest drivers for companies in these spaces are your capital costs or your CapEx to build a project and your cost of capital. And time and again, I've seen this happen where development teams get very excited and they go out and they partner with a private equity firm and they think it's fantastic because they have all this money and the private equity firm is sucking all the juice out of the orange. So you really need, I think, when you think, and every company is trying to drive down the costs of the installation, and United Wind is doing that very well. The nice thing is our software assessment tool is a real natural barrier to entry because it took a lot of time to develop. It can work globally. It can help us grow, and it prevents others from being able to do it, whereas going and screwing panels into a roof and using the solar radiance data that exists publicly is a little bit easier. I think Solar City is a good example of what a lot of these types of customers have gone through, where there's just been rapid growth, and this is a more public market, and I'm more of a private market guy, so I'm speculating here, but I think a lot of companies went public with these vast growth expectations, and they weren't able to fulfill them. The capital-intensive nature of these industries is tough. It's tough for VCs to continue to fulfill funding obligations with the requirement of returns that they have. So there needs to be a transition, and I think that's one of the things, again, coming to the institutional capital that United Wind has behind it is, I wouldn't say that it's cheap capital. We obviously have investors with strong return requirements that we intend to fulfill. But I think the other piece is that they're real institutional strategic players. So we have a lot of strategy, we say, in our boardroom with the investors. And so I think that helps us understanding that the growth and trajectory that we're on, and really that we're in a capital intensive business model, and we need to have an appropriate cost of capital to be successful in doing that.
Thank you. I really appreciate you sharing your perspectives on that. Let's open the floor to, let's open questions to another one from the floor.
Yes.
I got here a little late, so if you've already gone over what I'm going to ask you, pardon. I'm just wondering, you're a small company and TEPCO's a very large company, and when you started to structure your negotiation, maybe you could talk a little bit about that. I mean, were you guided by initially your lawyers, or you both had your own ideas and they coincided, or you had ideas and they didn't coincide at all, and now the lawyers?
So did you guys hear that in Japan? Or would you like me to...
Not too well. If you would repeat it, that'd be great.
Sure. So the question was, when we were first connected, was it guiding the discussion let me make sure I'm phrasing this correctly.
Well, the structure of the deal.
The structure of the deal, was it something that United Wind and TEPCO came to on their own, or did we have assistance in doing it, or did we have our own ideas that we brought to the table?
Yeah, was that easy to ride that horse together?
Was it easy to kind of get to the agreement? I guess I'll give United Wind's perspective and would pass it over, Yamaguchi-san, to your thoughts. I mean, United Wind's business model has been what it's been for several years now. And that really is to go out and develop and manage and own these assets and just grow that platform globally. And I think, TEPCO came to United Wind really expressing an interest in that particular model and how it could apply abroad. And at that time, United Wind was in a situation where we are growing very rapidly in the United States, but we do have on the horizon goals to grow abroad. So there really wasn't friction. It was very sort of cordial. Our goals resonated with their goals, our system, how we wanted to proceed, and really, the partnership is just beginning here as far as we're kind of doing diligence abroad to see how the market is, but we didn't have to change our business model in order to court TEPCO.
So is it a partnership, or was it are you set up as a subsidiary in Japan? You did it.
No, so TEPCO has invested into United Wind. And I had a slide showing, initially. So United Wind is backed by several key strategic investors. TEPCO is one of them, Statoil out of Norway, and Total out of France, and Forum Equity Partners out of Canada. So that's...
So it's really a venture capital investment, and it's not a direct investment in the sense that TEPCO gets management control in any way, right?
That's correct. No, it's a VC. They're an investor among investors within the corporate entity.
Okay. Were there adjustments that TEPCO had to make, Yamaguchi-san, in order to work with the business model that United Wind has?
This was a sort of not a big investment for TEPCO. Well, it was the first investment, venture investment for us, so we're not used to it. So this is a first small investment, and so TEPCO's objective was to sort of learn United Wind's platform and to seek the possibility of a joint venture business in Japan. So that was our objective, and so this was basically a partnership. So there was not a big negotiation. It was very smooth, and it was just the biggest challenge, as I said, was TEPCO's internal decision-making process. So there's a possibility that we will form a joint venture in Japan, but it depends on the market research that we have just started.
Okay, thank you. Let's go to another question.
Go ahead. I'd like to follow up with what you asked. Now, are you going to have a partnership in terms of profit sharing in the Japanese market? How do you structure it? And also in terms of technology transfer, ownership, that type of thing in your deal, how do you structure that deal?
Yeah, we couldn't hear that too well. Dan, if you would repeat it, would be great.
Sure. So the question was, is the partnership structured? How is the partnership structured to account for profit sharing and technology sharing and so forth? And the reality is, as Yamaguchi-san just said, in Japan right now, there's market diligence that's going to be that is taking place. Once we get the results of that diligence, we then would enter into specific sort of market partnership JV structures based on what that's telling us. So we haven't identified that. What TEPCO has done is made an investment in the corporate entity, and therefore, like any other shareholder, will enjoy the benefits of United Wind's value growth.
Okay, thank you. Next question.
Yeah, I'd like to go back in the other direction towards the technology right now. It appears that you are experts in horizontal axis generation technology. Considering Japan's topography and the issues there, is it possible that you might try to develop a solution involving vertical wind generation technology?
So the question was, given the topography in Japan, would we consider a vertical turbine technology to deploy in the Japanese market given the topography.
Okay.
I don't know, Yamaguchi. The brief answer from United Wind standpoint is we're technology agnostic. So we have, we take what is the best commercially proven technology and deploy it because it has to be bankable and financeable. To the extent the R&D team at TEPCO has thoughts that we can leverage, I think we would look to them, obviously, to see what they're. Yeah.
Yamaguchi-san, in following up this question, let me ask if TEPCO's production partners, for instance, the makers of the turbines in Japan, are they aware of this partnership? Have they talked to you at all? Or is it still too early?
Well, the production partners, we have the big utility scale wind turbines. We are partners for that. But for small turbines, I think
really not in Japan.
Okay. Different. And well, there are I think some manufacturers and installers in Japan, but we haven't worked with them before.
Okay. All right. So this really will be market development from the very first stage.
Right.
Okay. Next question.
Did you have any more? Or
I was just going to say, it looks like there might be a cost-benefit analysis required to seek that out.
Yeah, there's some work to be done.
Yeah, any interest in offshore wind?
So the question was, is there any interest in offshore wind? I'll let Yamaguchi-san respond, given the location in Japan.
Well, I know that there are a lot of offshore winds in Europe, like in the North Sea, or where there's a lot of wind and shallow sea. But in Japan, there are very few shallow seas, and there are issues of fishermen and stuff like that. And so it's very difficult to have an offshore generation in Japan. Although there's some offshore generation in Hokkaido, which is the northern part of Japan, but we don't have a big resource for offshore generation in Japan.
Yeah, the ocean drops off very quickly. Let me ask kind of one final question, and that is, if this is really successful, what would you like to see 5 years from now in this partnership? Will you be mostly developing the Japan market, or do you think that TEPCO and United Wind will be jointly developing third markets in some of your international activities? Yamaguchi-san, I'll ask you first.
So this is just a possibility, but we'd like to explore markets in Asian countries too. Well, Asia is big, and I don't know where to start with, but we'll start with Japan and see what happens, and think about Asian opportunities as a next step.
Okay, Dan, what will make this a real success for United Wind? What would you like to see in 5 years?
That's a great question. I would like to see, obviously it depends on the market diligence that comes out of TEPCO, but that additional incremental 10 gigawatts that is coming out over the next 15 years, to capture a good portion of it through the partnership in the next 5 years, and maybe be having 2 or 3 more countries in Asia where we could be having started a similar research on those market opportunities, leveraging what we have learned in Japan.
Okay. I think that's a good note to close our session today. Thanks for everybody in the audience for coming, even though it's raining. And if you would, please join me in thanking our 2 speakers today.
Let me just explain about the electricity system reform or deregulation in Japan. So in 2015, we have already set up a organizations quite similar to independent system operators in the US. And in 2016, April, as I said, full deregulation of the retail market has been attained. Well, Japan's retail market deregulation began in year 2000, so it took 16 years to deregulate the whole market in Japan. And well, legal structural unbundling is required to all incumbent electric utilities by 2020. We are sort of kind of catching up with the US in terms of deregulation. Next slide, please.
Before we go to that, Yamaguchi-san, can I ask? When you say that the full deregulation of the retail market, does that mean that there will be other private providers of retail electricity in Japan?
Yes, that is correct.
Okay.
Yeah, so retail competition is opened. So customers, residential customers can choose any supplier other than TEPCO. And there are more than 100 new suppliers, energy, well, we call it PPSs, but they're new suppliers who are in the market.
Okay.
So we already have a lot of competition, and TEPCO has already lost about 1 million customers. So that's a big churn.
Okay, thank you very much for the clarification.
Okay, so this slide explains that power demand and sales is declining due to population decline in Japan and also energy conservation in Japan, and of course competition. So we have a shrinking market in Japan. So that is why TEPCO is looking at the international market for growth, especially the Asian market, where there is still, we expect a lot of growth in Asian countries. So next slide. This is a slide that shows the energy mix before March 11, 2011, and what happened after. So before March 11, 2011, we had a sort of a balanced energy mix. As you can see, nuclear playing a big role as a base load of power. But after the crisis of 2011, we lost all of the nuclear power stations after that. So as you can see, in year 2014, we had to significantly increase our reliance on fossil fuels, namely coal and LNG. And TEPCO were importing or buying most expensive LNGs in the world. So as you can see on slide 2030, there is a plan, government plan to sort of restart some of the nuclear power stations remaining. We have a remaining nuclear power station called KK, Kashiwazaki Koriwa, in Niigata Prefecture, but we do not know when it will get restarted. So as you can see, we have to increase the proportion of nuclear, renewable, which is the blue part on the top.
While we're on this slide, let me ask, all of the oil and all of the LNG is imported from abroad, right?
Yes, almost all. Okay, thank you, Professor Dasha. My name is Hiro Yamaguchi. It's a great honor to be participating in this class from Tokyo. And it's an honor to talk about TEPCO and new partnership with United Wind. So let me start with a quick introduction of TEPCO. Can you go to the next slide, please? Okay, so a quick introduction about TEPCO. Well, in Japan, there are 10 incumbent utilities, and TEPCO is the largest with 29 million customers in the Tokyo area. And it accounts for about a third of Japan's total electricity demand. So after the Fukushima nuclear accident and crisis of March 11, 2011, things have changed drastically for TEPCO because we became virtually bankrupt after the crisis, and we are nationalized by the Japanese government now. Although, as far as stable supply of electricity is concerned, we have the world's highest reliability of electricity, and we provide technical expertise to all over the world. For instance, we do various consulting projects, 600 projects for 70 countries in the last 10 years. So next slide, please. So let me touch on quickly about the progress.
Hold on just a second. We're getting a blank on, I'm seeing a blank on your slide, Brianna. There we go.
Thank
there
you.
we go.
Thank you. So let me just quickly touch on the progress in Fukushima, decommissioning and decontamination. So as you know, due to gigantic earthquake, of the fossil fuels are imported.
Including the coal.
Including coal, yes.
Okay.
Yeah, we will start importing from the US as well, but we basically import mainly from Middle East countries and also Asian countries and Australia.
Okay, thank you.
So as for renewables, the Japanese energy policy shifted to promote renewables after the crisis of 2011. So just like, maybe not the US, but just like European countries, we introduced a feed-in tariff system in July 2012. And so the installed capacity of renewables has been increasing in a rapid pace. We don't have the numbers in the graph, but for instance, the installed capacity of renewable energy was like 1.5 gigawatt in 2011, but now it's close to 10 gigawatts.
Wow.
And we're looking at like more than 20 gigawatts by 2030. So Japan, as an energy policy, we are going to increase renewables for energy security reasons. So the next slide. Okay, so this slide shows 4 big trends that are going on in the energy industry in the world, which starts with a D, which is namely deregulation, decentralization, decarbonization, and digitalization. So deregulation, I talked about full market competition in Japan. US and England is ahead in deregulation, and Europe. And in Asian countries, we see that some Asian countries have started deregulation. So this is a worldwide trend. And the second, decentralization, this is basically distributed energy resources is increasing. What I mean that tsunami, all the power was lost in Fukushima, and 4 reactors suffered meltdown. But as you can see in the pictures, we have made a remarkable progress, and reactors are stably cooled, and preparations for spent fuel and debris removal are in progress at Fukushima. So the next slide, please. This is the organizational structure of TEPCO. We just shifted to a holding company structure in April of this year. So we have the holding company, and below that we have 3 major subsidiary companies. So holding company is basically responsible for Fukushima D&D, decontamination and decommissioning, and also Fukushima revitalization, and also compensation to the victims of the accident, and also restart of the remaining nuclear power stations. But also one of the important functions of the holding company is promotion of renewable energy, and also innovations and R&D related to that. And as a subsidiary, we have set up a fuel and thermal power generation company, and a transmission distribution company, and a retail company, as you can see. And for fuel and thermal power generation, if you click on,
there we go.
Yeah, we have formed an alliance with a Chubu Electric company that is in Nagoya, in Japan. And we will, as for the fuel procurement and thermal power, we will merge into this new company called JERA. So JERA will be a new company responsible for fuel procurement and domestic and international thermal power generation business. Okay, next slide. So